In the early hours of November 13th, 1965, a fire broke out on the passenger liner Yarmouth Castle, with flames enveloping the entire ship so quickly they couldn't even send out a distress. Luckily, nearby vessels spotted the blaze, raised the alarm and raced to rescue the passengers and crew. By 4 AM, they'd successfully evacuated as many as they could, but tragically not everyone survived. 87 people went down with the ship, and 3 others later passed away in hospital due to their injuries. So what happened that night? How did what started as a regular cruise so quickly descend into such a tragedy? The SS Yarmouth Castle began her service life in 1927 as the Evangeline, operating a liner service on the New York City to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia route. She was a twin-screw 115-metre passenger liner with a capacity for 750 passengers and 141 crew. A few years into her life, the Second World War broke out, necessitating her transfer to the War Shipping Administration, where she became primarily a troop transport vessel operating worldwide before she returned to civilian service on the 1st of July 1946. In her post-war refit, it was decided that it wouldn't be viable to bring the ship up to then modern design and safety standards, so the Coast Guard allowed her to keep her outdated wooden construction but insisted on some changes such as the addition of a ship-wide sprinkler system. Over the following decade, she was in and out of service operating a few different routes, before finally being sold and reflagged to the Panamanian Registry in 1963 under a new name, Yarmouth Castle. Her new owners operated her as a pleasure cruise ship, sailing the 186-mile passage between Miami, Florida and Nassau in the Bahamas, a route she maintained until her fateful final voyage on November 12, 1965. At 5 PM that evening, she departed Miami with 552 people on board, 376 passengers and 176 crew. Her route would have taken her to the northeast out of Miami towards the northwest Providence Channel, which led to the east before turning to the south straight down towards Nassau. Following departure, the passengers enjoyed a beautiful evening of fine dining in the restaurants as Yarmouth Castle continued through smooth seas with stars twinkling in the clear skies. As they retired to their staterooms for the night, the ship remained cool with a light southeasterly breeze blowing across the decks and through the natural ventilation system. They had no idea that a tragedy was just hours away. Around midnight 30, Yarmouth Castle was on a course of 101 degrees, passing through the northwest Providence Channel with a Finnish freighter around 8 miles ahead and another passenger ship, the Bahama Star, around 12 miles behind. Down in the engine room, the engineers suddenly noticed some smoke coming through the natural draft ventilation system, so they notified their chief, who immediately began searching for the source. Over the following minutes, he was joined in the search by others, including the ship's master, who could all smell smoke, but they struggled to quickly locate the fire. Unbeknown to them, it had broken out around midnight in an unmanned storage space which probably contained things like spare mattresses and broken deck chairs. As the space was originally a toilet, there was no sprinklers in the room, so the fire had taken hold unnoticed until the smell of smoke started wafting around the ship. By the time they did locate the blaze, it had already spread to the deck above and was so big that the fire extinguishers stood no chance. They subsequently attempted to fight it with fire hoses powered by the main fire pump, but even that had very little effect due to the sheer size of the inferno. The master returned to the bridge, but by now, the flames had reached the chart room and the radio room, severely hampering the onboard response. The radio officer was unable to transmit a distress message, and the second mate was unable to sound the general alarm, though he did manage to break a window and reach the electrical control to sound the ship's whistle, but didn't quite manage the complete signal of 7 short followed by 1 prolonged blast. Effectively, there was no alarm activated on board, so most of the passengers remained completely unaware of what was happening, until they heard the commotion or were awoken by others desperately banging on cabin doors. Around 01:30, the officer on watch on the MV Finpulp, the ship ahead of the Yarmouth Castle, noticed on radar that the range to the vessel astern of them had started to increase. He looked around and noticed a glow on the horizon in that direction, and when he looked through binoculars, he could see a ship on fire. Within 2 minutes, he'd summoned his ship's captain and they'd turned around to go and offer assistance. Their radio officer attempted to call the local station but got no response, so reported into the Coast Guard radio Miami at 01:54 that they could see a vessel on fire. Meanwhile, astern of the Yarmouth Castle, the master of the Bahama Star was looking out of his porthole for the Great Stirrup Lighthouse light when he noticed an orange glow on the horizon off the port bow. When he got to the bridge, he could see that the glow was another vessel on fire, so he immediately ordered his helmsman, "Come left, steer for that ship. Back on the Yarmouth Castle, the crew were doing whatever they could to pull passengers out of the accommodation and start launching the lifeboats, just hoping that somebody would come to their aid. The first lifeboat to get away was the one with the emergency radio inside. The master and some crew abandoned ship in that boat, later describing their intention of using the radio and flares to try and raise the alarm. This left other crew to manage the evacuation on board, which was further hampered by things like paint on the fall ropes causing them to jam and boats being launched without rowlocks, which forced the crew to paddle them like canoes. By 2:15, the first responding ship, the Finnish freighter Finpulp, was on scene, stopped just a third of a mile away from the burning Yarmouth Castle. They lowered their portside lifeboat and starboard gangway to receive the first survivors, which included the Yarmouth Castle's master, who informed them that there were around 600 persons on board and lifeboats would be needed for the rescue. The boats that had managed to get away from the burning ship dropped off whoever they could and returned to continue transferring survivors. Just 10 minutes after Finpulp, Bahama Star also arrived on scene, drawing along the starboard side of Yarmouth Castle at 2:25. You can only imagine what must have gone through the minds of the survivors when they saw the rescue ships appearing out of the darkness. Bahama Star placed 14 of their lifeboats into the water and began taking on board hundreds of passengers and crew from the burning Yarmouth Castle. By now, Finpulp's earlier report of a vessel on fire had worked its way from the Coast Guard radio station through to the Coast Guard Air Station Miami, where they got the first fixed-wing aircraft into the air at 2:36. Over the next hour or so, a further 3 fixed-wing and 3 rotary aircraft were airborne and heading towards the scene to provide illumination through the night, as well as evacuation of seriously injured passengers from the rescue vessels. On board Yarmouth Castle, down in the engine room, the engineers kept the fire pump running to give as much pressure as possible to those fighting the fire on deck. They even plumbed the bilge pump into the fire main to try and keep the hoses going until everyone could get off. By 4:15, the evacuation was complete and all survivors had been recovered to either the Finpulp or to the Bahama Star. Both vessels remained on scene for the next few hours, watching in horror as the Yarmouth Castle continued to burn until she finally slipped beneath the waves at 6:03. After that, the 2 ships left to transfer the survivors to Nassau, leaving the aircraft continuing the search until 17:45 that afternoon. When they left, silence finally descended on the scene, with the remains of the Yarmouth Castle resting peacefully hundreds of metres below, somewhere in the northwest Providence Channel. With the wreck remaining undiscovered to this day, investigations relied heavily on witness reports and inspections of Yarmouth Castle's sister ship, but still, vital lessons have been learned. Converting a toilet space into a store cupboard meant that combustible materials were stored in an unprotected space and possibly even ignited by jury-rig lighting or sparks from soot blowing. Once it got going, the fire then spread rapidly through a wooden superstructure before eventually being detected through manual searches. The detection delay meant that fighting the fire quickly became impossible and evacuation became the only option. Failure to ring the general alarm early on led to delays in mustering and evacuating passengers, and the failure to broadcast an early distress led to the reliance on nearby vessels raising the alarm instead. It was down to luck that other vessels were close enough to respond, and they did in an exemplary way, ultimately leading to the rescue of 462 people. The Yarmouth Castle tragedy became a pivotal moment in commercial maritime history, leading to significant changes in safety regulations for passenger ships. The inquiry into the disaster revealed critical flaws in ship design, emergency preparedness and crew training, so as a result, international maritime safety standards were strengthened, mandating better fire detection systems, more rigorous inspections and improved materials to reduce fire risks on board ships. Although the wreck of the Yarmouth Castle itself remains undiscovered, the lessons learned from this tragedy have saved countless lives in the decades since. Finally, I would just like to extend a massive thanks to this channel's Plus supporters on Patreon. You voted for this video, so without you, this video literally wouldn't have been made. On behalf of everyone watching, thank you so much.